crafters, this is Raquel with Paints and Glitter. I'm coming along with a project for Paper Rose Studio. I'm going to be using these gorgeous papers. They're called Easter Time Patterns. It's a set of 12 by 12 papers that are double-sided. You get 2 of each of 12 designs and they're printed on 200 GSM paper. I'm also going to be working with 2 dies here. There's 3 crosses die, and then there's also this one that's called Stained Glass Dove. So I'm going to be making some cards for you today, and I hope that you enjoy this video tutorial. Don't forget to leave a comment, a thumbs up, and subscribe if you're new. So let's get started. Okay, so we're going to be starting with the Stained Glass Dove metal die that you see there in the corner. I've cut it out of white cardstock, and as you see there, I've left in the die cut a lot of the little pieces that form the little white dove. That's the main image here. And then I've also cut a solid square, so I will be adhering that intricate die cut right on top of that white square. And then using some sky blue ink, I'm actually going to just start inking right in the center where that little dove is placed, trying to avoid any spaces outside of the little dove. And this is to give a very soft shadow to this little dove. And of course you can use any colors that you like, because depending on the background you may want to go a little bit lighter or darker. To supplement this, I'm using a Copic marker in BG10, and I'm again revisiting some of those little pieces that I've left inside of the die cut, again creating some shadows. So I'm strategically coloring this using some little flick motions, just so that I add the darkest color where the little dove would naturally have shadows, and then avoiding the rest. I'm also using this color, which is B60 if I'm not mistaken, and this is a violet color. It's very, very light, and what I'm doing here is coloring around the dove now, because I wanted this to look a little bit like a stained glass window, and if I left it stark white you may not see the image too well. But once you've colored it to your liking, you can then take a third die cut, and then this is the same as what I had cut out in white, only I've used this beautiful metallic paper, and I'll be placing that right on top, and that way it highlights the image a little bit more. So there's the result, and this is one way in which you can get some color on that image. And now using one of the rectangles, these are the stitch rectangles from Paper Rose. I've actually cut the paper already, but if you see here, I've moved it down, and that's because you can always use the dies to cut your paper a little bit smaller if you wish to do so. The little stitching lines will match up, and what I did was that I cut it down to 5.5 inches tall. So there again, I'm using the same technique for the second matting layer, and this will actually go on the inside of the card. But those are layers that I'll be using, and of course they're from this beautiful Easter paper collection, Easter Time Patterns. Because they're double-sided, then of course you choose the side you prefer. Now I'm also using some stitch square dies. I've cut out a piece of white pearlescent and a holographic card, and then I use a smaller one to cut into it. So this is about 2 1/8 inches tall, and what I did was that I cut an aperture into that paper, and that's just so that I could use the paper that will be left over on a different card, and you'll see that in a minute. But once I have these adhered, I'm going to actually layer this with that square frame. And it's a great way, of course, to extend your pretty papers. If you have any specialty papers and you don't want to miss out on what would otherwise just lay behind a die cut, then you can always do that. So there's the result of that. I'm going to be pairing this with one of the sentiments from the collection that says Easter Blessings. And now I've taken this small leaf die. As you can see, it cuts out 3 leaves. But I'm actually cutting away a portion of each leaf, and this is a great way to transform a die cut. is to remove any part of it you wish to not use, and the only reason I'm doing so is because that main image on this card that has the stained glass dove also has the olive branch that the dove is carrying in her beak, and the olive branch has a longer, thinner leaf, and so I thought it would be great to alter the die cut and also paint it using some watercolors. So I did cut those little leaves out of 300 GSM card. So a nice heavy cardstock or watercolor cardstock is what you want to use for this technique. But of course you can alter them. And what I've done is mixed a little bit of a light blue and a light turquoise color. That way they wouldn't be too dark. And of course all of the colors in this pan of watercolors are all pastels. So they do give a nice light result to your coloring. And now I'm mixing two different colors of brown and just using that as a splatter to provide the tiniest bit of shadow to these little leaves. And then I'm going to repeat that with the lilac color that's also in this pan. So it's a very easy technique to alter any die cuts. And because I'm using such light colored backgrounds, I didn't want these to be too vibrant, but they turned out perfectly for this card. Now using the polka dot paper from this Easter collection, I'm going to use that as the base for a 5x7 card. So I did cut that down to 4 and 15/16 by 6 and 15/16, and then this is the blue panel that I had shared with you, and you can see on the back of that there are the other little images. So of course you use the side that you prefer. I wanted to keep this as a very soft palette of colors because of the delicate nature of the die cuts that I'll be using today. So here what I'm grouping is the two clusters of leaves on the top right hand corner of the card, and there you see how they match the colors that were used on the dove as well. So I thought that was a pretty neat result. I'll use two more on the bottom left hand corner, and then I'm going to nestle that little sentiment right behind one of those leaves. And I'm almost done with this card, but I'm super happy with the results. I wanted to show you, however, a second way in which you can use the same die cut. So in this case, I'm only applying adhesive right behind the image of that dove that I mentioned earlier. So I'm being very, very delicate here, and this applicator helps me quite a bit because it has such a thin nozzle that if you like to work with intricate cuts, then it's a very easy way to go about it. So here what I've done is that I'm using some really beautiful cardstock again to highlight the image of that dove. So what I've done is that after adhering it to that shiny white paper, I am now going to fussy cut around the dove so that only the dove remains. And so of course for this you want to take your time, but the one tip I can give you is to use really good scissors, and that makes the work a whole lot easier. So here I'm going to be using the same die cut again, only this time I cut it out in a pink specialty card. I'll be layering that right on top of that little dove that I cut out, and then on top of another piece of card that is holographic. So now in this instance I'm again applying adhesive only on the little image of the dove. And this is going to help me adhere this layer right on top. And you want to take your time with this, of course. You don't want to rush through it. The other tip I can give you here is that when you're doing this technique, because you're going to get little droplets of adhesive on your specialty card, I recommend you keep a wet or damp, I should say, paper towel or a baby wipe. And that's a really easy way to go ahead and clean up that paper as quickly as you can, as you see me doing there, for any droplets of adhesive that may have been left behind. And now you can go ahead and adhere this to your card. This time around, however, I'm going to be double matting this. So I'm first using a white piece of card cut out with the stitch squares, And then that's going to go on to a second layer, which is holographic paper. It matches the background of what I had used with the dove. And I did use another sentiment from my stash that is in Spanish. But first I'm going to go ahead and apply the layers of this card. It's also the 5x7 size. And I'm also using that beautiful blue plaid on top of that very light peachy polka dot paper. And again, I've cut out yet another rectangle for a matting layer using the holographic paper. And I did the same technique, which is that I cut away the center so that I don't misuse that paper and no one will see it. So it's a fantastic way to stretch your supplies. And then this can now go on the front. And these are both top folding. Actually, all four of the cards you'll see today are top folding cards. I make my own bases just using 300 GSM cards, so that way they're nice and sturdy. And it's a wonderful way to create cards of the size that you prefer. Now I'm going to nestle the little leaves this time around in between the two frames that I had created. And this is again just to kind of pull your eye toward the center of this image, even though I'm adding the leaves on the top right and bottom left hand corner. But it's also to emulate that beautiful little image of the branch, which represents peace, of course, with the little image of the dove. And then this is the little flag sentiment. It says Feliz Pascua, so that is in Spanish. And I did complete these little cards adding Nouveau drops in a very light color green, and also added the little eyes to the little doves. And this completes these two cards. Now moving on to the second two. We'll be using the die set that is the 3 crosses. So this die set actually has 2 dies. One of them will cut the solid circle. I'm using 3 colors of ink to create what would be a sunset-like blend of colors. So I'm starting off with the lightest, which is the yellow, then moving on to the peachy color that you see me using there, and then lastly the more coral looking color. So as you can see, what I'm doing is very lightly brushing that color onto this circle, going from light to dark. And of course you can maneuver the paper as you wish, but the idea is to get a very light blend. And then using the second portion of this die cut, the one that has the 3 crosses, I'm using some Mull Lavender Distress Oxide ink. But I'm going to be using this very light lavender color. Now what I'm doing is I'm actually matching the colors in that gorgeous paper. So that's a wonderful way to incorporate the colors of the papers that you enjoy onto the die cuts you'll be using. Now I also wanted to add a little bit of highlight to this sunset. So for that I have used 2 of the different colors of blue in this palette of watercolors. And I'll be blending both of those with a little bit of water and then just splattering that on the background. And it's going to give the same look of splatter that the paper already has, and it'll just make it all more cohesive. So now I can layer the little cross die cut right on top, and that can go on the front of my card. But I want to show you another way that you can do this. The die cut also cuts out this portion here, which is also the background, but what I'm doing is I'm coloring it the same way that I had colored the solid circle. So this is just to show you 2 different alternatives, but I'm using the same exact color combination, same technique, and what will be different here is how I end up finishing this particular die cut a little later on with a little bit of shine. If you like the detail of that sunshine look on the background, then of course you can use the die cut that will cut out of your paper, or you can omit it as I did it for the first card. So it's all a matter of personal preference, of course, but here I'm using again that lavender color. It's very subtle, very light, but it keeps the paper from looking like a stark white piece of card, and again it matches the papers with the floral background. So I found that to be very pretty. Okay, so once you're done with all of your coloring, of course, you can now layer this onto a solid circle. And I'm first adhering the bottom layer. It'll make it a whole lot easier to match up. So that can go onto that solid circle that you can cut using that die cut, or I should say that die. And now the shadow will match perfectly. And that will nestle right behind those crosses there. So this has a bit more texture, of course. I think it's absolutely beautiful. And now what I'm doing is adhering the first one that I had created. And what you want to be mindful of here is to make sure that you have that orange portion, which is the darkest part of the sky, right on the top. So here I'm just going to position this so that it is centered, but a little bit closer to the top of the card than the bottom, so that I have room for a sentiment. I'm adding the cluster of leaves. This time around I did not add color to these leaves because there's plenty of color on the background, so a plain white card will do. I'm using some custom sentiments that I've created. The first one says he is risen, and then I'm going to couple this with the yellow plaid paper included also in the paper collection. And these will be 6x6 cards, so each panel is about, I'm going to say, a 1/16 of an inch smaller in graduated sizes. And here's what I had mentioned was that I would add a bit of glimmer, so I'm using a glimmer gloss pen. It does not have any color, it just leaves a bit of shine on the papers, and it is also very subtle, so it's a really beautiful way to add some shine without it being too glitzy, if you will. And that's how I decided to finish off these cards. And I'll also be adding a few drops in a moment. But I really like the delicate look of this, but also the fact that you can have the papers be very centered, or very central, I'm sorry, to the card design. So it doesn't take away from it in any way that you add extra little leaves. It's all very delicate and pretty, and that's the style of card that I wanted to make. So once all of those matting layers were together, now I can of course adhere this to that 6x6 base. Then to finish this off, as I mentioned before, I will be adding some drops, so that's going to come up momentarily here. Just want to make sure that I burnish that background really well. And here are the dream drops that I'll be using. These will end up looking like little pearls. So nothing too flashy here. These are just some very delicate little cards using some easy techniques that you can use with any type of supplies that you may have on hand. I do hope that you have enjoyed this video. It was a lot of fun to create with these supplies from Paper Rose Studio. Don't forget that I do invite you to use the affiliate links available in the description bar of my video, and also come back for the other Easter themed video that I have for you using Rustic Easter from Paper Rose. I have enjoyed using these supplies and invite you to always come back. Subscribe if you like, and I hope that you can be inspired and be blessed.